Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavai Tejasvinavaditamastu Mavidvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us. May he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Peace, peace, peace. And good evening. This is Swami Abhedananada, and this is Atma. We're here. Yeah, we liked reading about reincarnation so much, we're going to do it all over again. All right, so we're going to start, what page is 183 or 182?
182.
182. All right, so go ahead.
The argument advanced by the supporters of the theory of hereditary transmission does not furnish a satisfactory explanation of the cause of the inequalities and diversities of the universe. Why is it that the children of the same parents show a marked dissimilarity to their parents and to each other? Why do twins develop into dissimilar characters and possess opposite qualities, although they're born of the same parents at the same time and brought up under similar conditions and environments? How can heredity explain such cases? Suppose a man has 5 children. One is honest and saintly. Another is an idiot, and the third becomes a murderer. The fourth a genius or prodigy, and the fifth a cripple and diseased. Who made these dissimilarities? They cannot be accidents. There is no such thing as an accident. Every event of the universe is bound by the law of cause and effect. There must be some cause of these inequalities. Who made one honest and saintly, another an idiot, and so forth? But parents cannot be the cause. They never dreamed that they would beget a murderer or a villain or an idiot. On the contrary, all parents wish their children to be the best and happiest. But in spite of such desires, they get such children. Why? What is the cause? Does the theory of heredity explain it? No, not at all. Suppose a man, 24 years old, who has certain traits like musical or artistic talents, such as painting and so on, has a crooked nose and other peculiarities like cross eyes, which resemble those of his grandfather. Now suppose his grandfather died 6 years before he was born. Now, those who believe in the theory of heredity will say that this young man inherited all these peculiarities from his grandfather. When did he inherit? His grandfather had died 6 years before he was born. He inherited, of course, in the form of that germ. And what is that germ like? A minute protoplasm, a jelly-like substance. And if you examine it with the powerful microscope, you will hardly find any difference between it and the protoplasmic germ of a dog, or of a cat, or of a tree. It is smaller than a pin's head, and in that state this young man inherited all these peculiarities from his grandfather. Or in other words, before he had a nose, he got a crooked nose. Before he had eyes, he inherited cross eyes. And before he had any brain, he inherited all the wonderful powers, his musical and artistic talents. Does that not seem absurd to you? Even if we admit that this theory of heredity, then what do we understand? That the whole of this young man existed in the form of a protoplasm before he was born? His cross eyes, his crooked nose, his artistic talents, all these pre-existed in the form of a protoplasmic cell? This leads up to the same thing which is taught by the theory of reincarnation. Or in other words, if it be possible for this young man to remain in the form of a protoplasm and inherit all these things before his birth, why cannot we believe that the soul or the subtle body of this young man possessed them from the very beginning? According to Vedanta, this young man was not the creature of his grandfather, but he had his own independent existence. Only by coming through the channel of his parents, he had received certain characteristic impressions. Just as a tree in its process of growth will receive from the environments certain peculiarities when it assimilates those properties. The doctrine of reincarnation alone can explain satisfactorily and rationally the diversities among children and the reason of many instances of uncommon powers and genius displayed in childhood. The theory of heredity has up to this time failed to give any good reason for them. Why is it that Pascal, when 12 years old, succeeded in discovering for himself the greater part of plane geometry? How could the shepherd Mangiamel, when 5 years old, calculate like an arithmetical machine? Think of the child Zara Colburn. When he was under 8 years of age, he could solve the most tremendous mathematical problems instantly and without using any figures. In one instance, he took the number 8 and raised it up progressively to the 16th power and instantly mentioned the result, which contained 15 figures. Of course, he was right in every figure. When asked the square root of numbers consisting of 6 figures, he would state the result instantly with perfect accuracy. He used to give the cube root of hundreds of numbers and the hundreds of millions the very moment when it was asked. Somebody asked him once how many minutes there were in 48 years, and he answered 25,228,800.
I heard of a funny incident. They talk about the influence of your environment and so forth. There was a case where this woman had 8 sets of twins. Guess what get what the wife's husband did? He made bookends. Anyway. It's just a joke. All right. Yeah, so we'll continue with these amazing. Of course, there have been many incidences of amazing talents of people, even since Swami Abhedananada was writing and talking 100 years ago. But so we'll continue.
Mozart, the great musician, wrote a sonata when he was 4 years old, and an opera in his 8th year. Teresa Melanola played the violin with such skill that many people thought that she must have played before her birth. There are many such instances of wonderful powers exhibited by artists and painters when they were quite young. Shankaracharya, the great commentator of the Vedanta philosophy, finished his commentary when he was 12 years old. Now, how can such cases be explained by the theory of hereditary transmission?
Yeah, that reminds me of another thing. The occupation that has the greatest chance of being reincarnated in the same occupation is philosopher. Because when they die, they go into the realm of wordless thought and they realize they've made all sorts of mistakes. And they have to come back and fix it. But then, of course, they're right back in the realm of words. And so they end up coming back and refuting their old stuff, but just making another set of philosophies that have mistakes in it. So they just go on like this forever. All right. I suspect that there are only a few philosophers, and they just keep getting reborn.
They just keep coming back.
All right, let's go on.
Many of you have heard of the wonderful musical talents of Blind Tom. This blind Negro slave was born on his master's plantation, was brought up as typically Negro. He received no training in music or in any other line. One day, when his master's family were at dinner, he happened to come into his master's parlor and displayed his marvelous musical power for the first time by playing on the master's piano. Afterwards, he was exhibited in different states of this country. Physically, he was nothing but a typical Negro. His intellect was very poor, but in music he was a master. His musical talents were so great that he composed music for himself and played his own compositions. Sometimes after hearing a new piece of rapid music once, he could reproduce it note by note. Where did he get all these powers? From whom did he inherit them? His parents perhaps never heard of a piano. He never had a lesson in his life, and he could not have understood even if he had had any. Not long ago I saw a girl of about 6 years who played the piano most beautifully and who could reproduce the most difficult music after hearing it once. Seems to me that she must have played the piano in her previous incarnation. This is the only explanation that we can give.
Yeah, there's a similar incident in Mozart's life where there was a choral composition that they would sing at the Vatican, and it was such a beautiful piece that the Vatican didn't want anybody else to be able to perform it. It was just going to be their exclusive work. But Mozart went to hear it, and he went home and wrote it down. Then everybody could do it. He wrote it down note perfect after. I think he went back a second time just to make sure he'd gotten all the notes right. But basically, he got it all right the first time. So the Vatican no longer had exclusive use of that particular work. All right.
Does heredity explain such cases? No. These illustrations are sufficient to disprove the theory of cumulative heredity. Cumulative means gradualness. The believers in this theory say that a genius is the result of cumulative heredity, that is, it presents itself by degrees from less genius to greater and still greater and so on. In the whole history of the genealogy of geniuses like Homer, Plato, Shakespeare, Goethe, Raphael, there never was in their families almost Plato, almost Shakespeare, or almost Goethe. Neither is it possible to trace the extraordinary powers of any of these back to any member of their ancestral line. Therefore, we can say that no other theory than that of reincarnation can explain satisfactorily the causes which produce geniuses and prodigies in this world.
Of course, sometimes they do get born in families that have extraordinary abilities. Bach was born into a family where in that part of Germany, the name Bach was almost synonymous with musician. If somebody said they played an instrument or something, somebody would say, "Oh, were you a Bach?" So, and it's interesting that his first set of children from his first wife, I think he was second cousins with his first wife. They all became musicians. Then she died, and he married again and had a bunch of other children. I think about 14 or 15 other children, and most of those were not musicians. So I don't know. So there's something to inbreeding there. You can get some talents from inbreeding. All right, let's go on.
Those who accept the truth of reincarnation do not blame their parents for their poor talents or for not possessing extraordinary powers, but they remain content with their own lot, knowing that they have made themselves as they are today by their own thoughts and deeds in their previous incarnations. They understand the meaning of the saying, "What thou sowest, thou must reap," and always endeavor to mold that future by better thoughts and better deeds. They explain all the inequalities and diversities of life and character by the law of karma, which governs the process of reincarnation, as well as the gradual evolution of the germs of life from lower to higher stages of existence. Chapter 3. Evolution and Reincarnation. The amazing achievements of modern science have been opening every day new gates of wisdom and slowly bringing human minds nearer and nearer to the ultimate reality of the universe. The fire of knowledge kindled by science has already burnt down many dogmas and beliefs held sacred by the superstition of the past, which stood in the way of truth-seeking minds. In the first place, science has disproved the theory of the creation of the universe out of nothing by the action of some supernatural power. It is shown that the universe did not appear in its present form or come into existence all of a sudden only a few thousand years ago, but that it has taken ages to pass through different stages before it could reach its present condition. Each of these stages was directly related to a previous stage by the law of causation, which always operates in accordance with definite rules. The phenomena of the universe, according to science, are subject to evolution, or gradual change, and progressive development from a relatively uniform condition to a relative complexity. From the greatest solar system down to the smallest blade of grass, everything in the universe has taken its present shape and form through this cosmic process of evolution. Our planet Earth has gradually evolved, perhaps out of a nebulous mass, which existed at first in a gaseous state. The sun, moons, stars, satellites, and other planets have come into existence by going through innumerable changes produced by that evolutionary process of the cosmos. Through the same process, plants, insects, fishes, reptiles, birds, animals, man, and all living matter that inhabits this earth have evolved from minute germs of life into their present forms. The theory of evolution says that man does not come into existence all of a sudden, but is related to lower animals and to plants, either directly or indirectly. The germ of life had passed through various stages of physical form before it could appear as a man. That branch of science, which is called embryology, has proved the fact that man is the epitome of the whole creation. It tells that the human body, before its birth, passes through all the different stages of the animal kingdom, such as the polyp, fish, reptile, dog, ape, and at last man. If we remember that nature is always consistent, that her laws are uniform, and that whatever exists in the microcosm exists also in the macrocosm, and then study nature, we shall find that all the germs of life which exist in the universe are bound to pass through stages resembling the embryonic types before they can appear in the form of man.
Yes, of course, that was the prevailing theory, this epic of man being the pinnacle, is so no progress is going to be made in the future or something. It's a little bit time-centric and human-centric, but obviously it doesn't mean evolution is going to stop now. Things may continue for a long time. We're just a blip on the screen of evolution. You wonder what took evolution so long. The other thing that struck me was this idea of something out of nothing, but yet the Big Bang Theory is just about that. It's creation out of nothingness. Which I have a lot of problems with myself, just for that reason. Very difficult to create something out of nothing. But of course, it's correct in saying that when you look at the genetics of different organisms, we find that we have huge amounts of our genetic material in common with other living things. Even going back to bacterias and plants and various animals, a lot of that genetic machinery is common to all of living things. So we definitely are all part of one continually evolving living being. And of course that brings into all sorts of other questions about what is life and that sort of thing. But let's go on and see. It's too bad he didn't live 100 years later. We would have lots more insights. Some of his information's a little bit dated.
In explaining the theory of evolution, science says that there are two principal factors in the process of evolution. The first is the tendency to vary, which exists in all living forms, whether vegetable or animal. The second is the tendency of environment to influence that variation, either favorably or unfavorably. Without the first, evolution of any kind would be absolutely impossible. But the cause of that innate tendency to vary is still unknown to science. Upon the second depends the law of natural selection. The variation must be adapted to favorable conditions of life. Consequently, either the germ of life will select suitable environments or vary itself in order to suit the surrounding conditions, if they are unfavorable. But the agent of this selective process is the struggle for existence, which is a no less important factor. Thus, evolution depends on these three laws: tendency to vary, or variation, natural selection, and struggle for existence. Science tries to explain through these three laws the physical, mental, intellectual, moral, and spiritual evolution of mankind. The theory of evolution will remain unintelligible until science can trace the cause of that innate tendency to vary, which exists in every stage of all living forms. If we study closely, we find that man's self consists of two natures, one animal and the other moral or spiritual.
Yeah, before we go too much further, I'll just mention again that one of the amazing things is, there's a lot of resistance to Darwin's theories, and yet you wonder why, when you realize that they had been breeding animals for centuries. It was very common to take two animals with superior characteristics and mate them together and raise them, and then select the ones that had the best properties for their particular use and so forth. So breeds of dogs and breeds of chickens and breeds of horses and cows and all of the animals that people have used since they domesticated animals. They've been practicing natural or man-made selection, following these ideas of natural selection, and yet people seem to find it so difficult to understand what Darwin was trying to say. So that's one of the interesting things, and certainly from the standpoint of Vedanta, we understand that this whole manifestation is we think of it as the manifestation of the Divine Mother, and that's a world of multiplicity. And it's coming from the infinite, undivided, unchanging, absolute oneness of Brahman. And they're the same thing. Brahman has the power of Maya to manifest variation. If you don't see it as oneness, you're going to see it as variation. And so it evolves in this way towards greater and greater diversity, and yet it's always striving to manifest its ultimate reality, its infinite, undivided, and unchanging nature. So that's the interesting part of it. All right, let's go on.
If we study closely, we find that man's self consists of two natures, one animal and the other moral or spiritual. Animal nature includes all the animal propensities: desire for sense enjoyments, love of self, fear of death, and struggle for existence. Each of these is to be found in lower animals as well as in human beings, the difference being only in degree and not in kind. In a savage tribe, the expression of this animal nature is simple and natural, while in a highly civilized nation it is expressed not in a simple and straightforward manner, but in an artful and refined way. In a civilized community, the same nature working through varied device, policy, and plan brings the same results in a more polished form. In the struggle for existence amongst lower animals and savage tribes, those who are physically strong survive and gain advantage over those who are physically weak. While in the civilized world, the same result is obtained not by displaying physical force, but by art, diplomacy, policy, strategy, and skill. Various kinds of defensive and offensive weapons have been invented to conquer those who are less skillful in using them, although they may be physically stronger. The simple expression of animal nature, which we notice in savages and lower animals, by the natural process of evolution, has gradually become more and more complex, as we find in the civilized nations of the world. The energy of the lower human nature is spent chiefly in the struggle for material existence.
Of course, now we have the advantage of decades of primate research where they've been able to study our primate cousins and notice that many of the same kinds of social features and so forth pop up in these groups as well. That it's not just unique to human beings, that we have certain kinds of social customs and hierarchies and so forth, and that it varies. I mean, some of them are will display one type of aspect that we have in humans, and another group of primates will just emphasize a different one. Some are more cooperative and some are more competitive. Yes. But there's, an extended period of having to nurture their young, which is a great influence on how the family unit gets together and so forth. So it's interesting, and it's too bad he doesn't have all that information, but that's a whole topic unto itself. All right, so where are we here?
But there is another nature.
Right, okay.
But there is another nature in man which is higher than this. It expresses itself in various ways, but on a higher plane. Love of truth, mastery over passion, control of the senses, disinterested self-sacrifice, mercy and kindness to all creatures, desires to help the distressed, forgiveness, faith in a supreme being, and devotion. All these are the expressions of that higher moral and spiritual nature. They cannot be explained as developed from animal nature by means of the struggle for material existence. But these qualities are not to be found in lower animals, although the struggle for existence is there.
There again, I think I would beg to differ on some of that. You certainly see certain kind of animals. I mean, if you've worked with animals enough, you see that dogs have different temperaments, and some of them are extremely compassionate and extremely interested in helping and being nurturing and so forth. Even cats. My sister had a whole bunch of cats. One of them was the sweetest cat and was always concerned about anything that would happen to any of the other cats or to her. And the others could care less, So you see these qualities propping up in certain animals, and anybody that studied groups of animals will tell you that you're going to have the big bully, and you're going to have the one that has to kind of be tricky in order to get its way and so forth. And their animals are very intelligent, and there certainly is evidence that they reason and that they plan, and it's not just instinct. There was a case in a museum where they couldn't figure out why the crabs kept disappearing out of the tank, and they blamed the night watchman. So the night watchman had to set up security cameras on the tank, and they found that the octopus in a neighboring tank got out of his tank and went over to the crab tank and ate the crabs, and then went back, and he knew that he could get away with that at night when there wasn't anybody around. So you can't say that this is some natural instinct or something at play. This is an octopus who has most of its nervous system in its 8 arms, not in its head. So you see, this goes back to the idea of what's conscious. And in those days, there was a general feeling that only humans were conscious, and there's still a great many neuroscientists that think consciousness is a property of human beings, and somehow it's not present in these other animals. And to me, that's just can't possibly be true. But that was a prevalent idea in those days. That, of course, I take the position that everything comes from consciousness. It's existence, consciousness, bliss. That's one of our ways of describing Brahman, and it all comes out of Brahman. We don't read it necessarily correctly, but it's in there. So consciousness has to be in there from the word go. It didn't just suddenly appear when we evolved out of other primates. That just doesn't make much sense. All right, let's go on.
The moral and spiritual nature of human beings cannot be traced as the outgrowth or gradual development of the animal nature. There is a dispute among the evolutionists as to the method of explaining their cause. Some say that these higher faculties have evolved out of the lower ones and have developed by variation and natural selection, while others hold that some other higher influence, law, or agency is required to account for them. Professor Huxley says, "As I have already urged, the practice of that which is ethically best, which we call goodness or virtue, involves a course of conduct which in all respects is opposed to that which leads to success in the cosmic struggle for existence. In place of ruthless self-assertion, it demands self-restraint. In place of thrusting aside or treading down all competitors, it requires that the individual shall not merely respect, but shall help his fellows. Its influence is directed not so much to the survival of the fittest, as to the fitting of as many as possible to survive. It repudiates the gladiatorial theory of existence. It demands that each man who enters into the enjoyment of the advantages of a polity shall be mindful of his debt to those who have laboriously constructed it, and shall take heed that no act of his weakens the fabric in which he has been permitted to live. Laws and moral precepts are directed to the end of curbing the cosmic process and reminding the individual of his duty to the community, to the protection and influence of which he owes, if not existence itself, at least the life of something better than a brutal savage." This comes from Evolution and Ethics. That's the title of the book. Professor Calderwood says, "So far as human organism is concerned, there seems no overwhelming obstacles to be encountered by an evolution theory, but it seems impossible under such a theory to account for the appearance of the thinking, self-regulating life distinctly human. As according to some of the best thinkers, the explanation of the moral and spiritual nature of man as a development of the animal nature is quite insufficient and unsatisfactory. The theory of natural selection in the struggle for existence cannot explain the cause of the higher nature of man. We cannot say that the theory is complete because it explains many facts. On the contrary, if it fails to explain a single fact, then it is proved to be incomplete. As such, the theory cannot explain satisfactorily the cause of the moral and spiritual nature of man, cannot be accepted as a complete theory. That explanation will be considered as complete, which will explain most satisfactorily all the various manifestations of the animal, moral, and spiritual nature. Moreover, supposing the tendency to vary has evolved into the moral and spiritual nature of man, science does not explain the cause of that tendency to vary, nor how animal nature can be transformed into moral and spiritual nature. Is that tendency to vary indefinite, or is it limited by any definite law? Science does not say anything about it.
Yeah, so again, I wouldn't agree that there isn't evidence that these qualities exist in other animals to a certain extent, but obviously not to the same extent. But I would agree that there's something else going on other than just evolution, which would help explain why there are sudden spurts in evolution and that type of thing. And that comes from this idea that there is this underlying existence consciousness bliss of which everything is a part and coming from. And that's the driving force that drives this drives the evolution. Oh, and there's another example of animal behavior, the dolphins and porpoises protecting humans. If humans are being threatened by sharks, they'll come up and hit the sharks with their snout. And that's interesting that that's what sharks are sensitive to, is blunt punches. If you ever have the unfortunate problem of being faced with a shark, hit him with your fist. Hit him in the belly with your fist. That's what they don't like, and that's what they'll turn around and go retreat from, which some people say gives credence to the idea that it's an extremely unpopular idea among anthropologists of the aquatic ape theory. Why do humans have the different characteristics that they do as opposed to other primates? And one theory is that we were forced to spend time in an island habitat, and hence on the beach a lot, looking for food, because the food resources on the island would dwindle. This would happen at a time when the oceans were rising during a time of global warming, which has happened many times. And so we'd be forced to go into the water. So the tendency would be that you'd lose your hair. You'd, instead of having, what do you call those things on the back of monkeys for sitting on trees? Proboscises or something. Anyway, they've got these hard areas on their rear ends, which are convenient for sitting on tree limbs, which is what you find in monkeys, but you don't find it in humans, and that's because we ended up sitting on the beach. We also have noses that go down this way. If you had a nose that's terribly flat, diving would be very difficult, and swimming in underwater would be very difficult. The water would have a tendency to go up your nose. So we developed so that the water doesn't go up our nose. And we developed this system of punching for fighting. So all of these little things. It also could be thought as a possible way that would increase the likelihood that we would develop speech. That's another complete mystery, is why humans developed speech. Now, we find some remnants of verbal communication among other animals, sounds of whales and dolphins, and some chattering of chimps and other animals that will give distress calls at times. But nothing like the kind of speech that we have with human beings. And why would that develop? Well, again, one theory is that if we had to spend time in the water, your body language pretty much disappears. If the only thing out of the water is your head, most of your body isn't able to express stuff. And so in order to communicate, you would be forced to communicate verbally. Also, if you're diving underwater, you have to learn breath control. And if you have to learn breath control, then you strengthen those muscles in your larynx that help you to talk. So all of those things give some credence to that theory, but I don't see any current people that are very interested in it. But Sir Alister Hardy and Elaine Morgan, probably 50 years ago or so, were promoting this idea, and it seems to have a lot of interesting ideas. The difficulty is, of course, that fossil records are going to be almost non-existent from things in the beach. You find fossil records well preserved in dry areas, so you're probably not going to find a whole lot of fossil records, although we find a lot of fossil records for fish and that sort of thing. So it's certainly possible.
Vedanta accepts evolution and admits the laws of variation and natural selection, governs the process of evolution as well as the law of causation. If we admit this grand truth of nature, then it will not be difficult to explain by the theory of evolution the gradual manifestation of the higher nature of man. The tendency of scientific monism is towards that end. Some of the modern scientists who hold the monistic position have found out the same truth which was discovered long ago by the Vedantic philosophers in India. J. Arthur Thompson, an eminent English scientist of the present day, in his book on the study of animal life, says, "The world is one, not twofold. The spiritual influx is the primal reality, and there is nothing in the end which was not also in the beginning." But the evolutionists do not accept this truth. Let us understand it clearly. It means what existed potentially at the time of the beginning of evolution is gradually manifested in the various stages and grades of evolution. If we admit that an uncellular germ of life or a bioplasm, after passing through various stages of evolution, is ultimately manifested in the form of a highly developed human being, then we shall have to admit the personality of all the manifested powers in that germ or bioplasm, because the law is that which exists in the end existed also in the beginning. The animal nature, higher nature, mind, intellect, spirit, all these exist potentially in the germ of life. If we do not admit this law, then the problem will arise: how can non-existence become existent? How can something come out of nothing? How can that come into existence which did not exist before? Each germ of life, according to Vedanta, possesses infinite potentialities and infinite possibilities. The powers that remain latent have the natural tendency to manifest perfectly and to become actual. In their attempt, they vary according to the surrounding environments, selecting suitable conditions or remaining latent as long as circumstances do not favor them.
Yeah, and I think this is a good time to point out that our consciousness, and we can assume that this would happen with the consciousness of other animals and even plants. There's a certain rudimentary type of consciousness exhibited by plants that seems to guide their evolution. So if you're faced with an ecological shift or crisis of some sort, or a necessity to adapt to a new environment, your consciousness would be driving you towards that goal. And we can see that your consciousness can have a big effect. This is the way Luther Burbank developed so many interesting plants. He would actively project his consciousness into the plants and try to commune with the plants and convince them to produce things like a thornless cactus and I can't remember some of the others. There's some amazing things that he did, and he did it by directing this evolutionary process with his mind and connecting with the consciousness of the plant. So he was able to do that. And of course, we know in healing too that this is a powerful force. I hope I've got the name right. Was it Sam Snead that was a famous golfer? One of the first famous golfers. Anyway, whoever it was, he was a famous golfer, and he was in a terrible car accident. Do you remember that? It was made into a movie. And the doctors declared that he would never walk again, much less play golf. And his friend, he and his friend worked together to get his ability back. And so the friend kept saying, "Now visualize your little toe moving. You're going to move your big toe. Move your big toe. Move your big toe." And eventually, he gained his ability to walk and play golf again. So, and there are lots of stories like that where people use their mental strength in order to produce cures in their own body. And so our consciousness does affect the physical. And so there's no reason to believe that collectively the consciousness of a group of organisms would not guide it evolutionarily to develop certain traits. Otherwise, it's very difficult to understand how things could develop. I mean, the classic example is the eye. You see, that's a first. Is even though there's rudimentary vision, can you just put it on mute?
Sorry.
There's a mute button there.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. It's mute.
Yeah, I forgot what I was saying. What was I talking about? Oh, the eyes, yes. Even though they're rudimentary organs of light sensitivity and other organisms, to suddenly develop all of the necessary structures for an eye seems quite incredible. And there are cases where you wonder how you should be able to mute the ring somehow.
I'm pressing mute, but it's not doing it.
Time to stop.
Anyway, it's time to stop anyway. But just to finish the thought finally. So you have to, it seems like you have to have some underlying force driving evolution at some point. Now the intelligent design people will call that God, but we just call it the innate consciousness of Brahman. Brahman is in there. And so that's your force of the evolving force. All right, so yes, time for us to close. And this will close our season as well. This Friday class is closing a little earlier than most of our classes. And we will resume after Labor Day. So all of you enjoy a great summer. And there are many other good classes and lectures online. So please take advantage of those. And we wish you well and hope to see you back in the fall. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Peace, peace,